This story begins in one distant kingdom, by the forest, namely in the city of Sikh. There were many different people in the street who were very tired of this life, for it was very hard. At this very time, there were a great many people in one of the taverns sitting there drinking. One boy went inside and heard someone asking the owner for another jug of wheat wine. However, the owner who stood behind the bar did not react in any way. People had already gotten used to it, and only the newcomers did not know that it was all useless, because no matter how much you called him, there would be no reaction. At this moment, a guy with bright red hair stepped inside and looked around and was very surprised. He was approached by another man who was sitting at the table with a glass of his liquor. I said the wine is on the counter, only he has to remember to put the money on the table. After all, they don't have self-service. But the guy was very surprised. He came closer to him and asked him what had happened. That man, sipping his glass, said that last month, the people of Tartaru had tried to kidnap the master's newborn son. However, they accidentally killed him when they tried to escape. The boy lowered his voice a little and asked, "Are these really the same people who kidnap babies for the sake of experimenting on them?" The boy didn't answer. That was correct. And now that the Holy See doesn't have time to deal with public safety, these creeps have gotten brazen. He, still in the same quiet voice, said that in that case they should be careful when they went outside. The man at this moment looked to the side and said in a cold voice that if that witch hadn't attacked the Holy See, they wouldn't have gotten to this point. However, at that moment, their conversations were suddenly interrupted by a violent cough and a splash of water that spilled over. The men immediately turned around and saw a girl sitting alone at the table with her hands covering her mouth. The guy with the red hair immediately came closer to her and asked if she was okay, or if she had something going on. The stranger was silent for a while, but afterward, with a heavy sigh, she said that he might not worry. There was nothing wrong with her. Then she raised her head, and the guy saw that she had tears in her eyes, and the girl, in turn, said that she was born that way. This stranger's name was Nilsi Glary, but she was actually called a witch. This girl was incredibly beautiful. In fact, she actually got into a third-grade novel about rebirth and place one day and ended up becoming the main character, a witch. Like all place novels, Nilsi has had a tragic life. The Holy See tricked the strongest witch into beginning to study the magic of immortality. And after that, he stripped her of everyone close to her and hunted her down for a bounty. At the last moment, she activated the failed magic circle she had created while studying immortality magic, and accidentally traveled back 20 years in her life. A few days later, a woman with fiery red hair single-handedly destroyed the Holy See's newly established research institute. And just like that, their plans for an eternal and happy life never came to fruition. They all burned to the ground. And that's why people started calling her the Scarlet Witch from then on. But in fact, the life of a witch is not as complicated as one might imagine. Of course, the girl has to disguise herself. However, despite her secrecy, she is often discovered. One beauty girl can easily make money for a living, but still in every situation there are disadvantages. This witch's body brings the poor girl a lot of trouble. And, whether it's natural disasters or disasters and the death of a neighbor's dog during childbirth, it makes her overwhelmed with an incredibly large sense of despondency that she can't get away from. And even if she tries her best to make herself happy, it's all completely useless, because there's always some little detail that ruins her plans for a happy life. And if she doesn't find something to do, she'll just die of depression before she can even enjoy the second life she's gotten herself into. However, she doesn't need to look for anything anymore, because she is the protagonist, which means that the problems themselves will find her, and she will have to deal with them. At the same time, a baby suddenly flew into the tavern and hit the wall. Then a huge man came in after him, with a small baby on a leash. The man who came in next turned to all present, apologizing, and said that they were just a new brother with his free will. That's why he taught him the rock. This huge man had a child sitting on a chain who was still alive and quite small, but already beaten. The man went on to pick up the second child, and the guy with the red hair asked what he was even doing. However, the man the kid was talking to asked, "Is he crazy?" and immediately started to take him by the arm so that he would not go further. If his life is important to him, he should keep his head down. He said he was an officer from Tartarus, and he was in charge of training suicide soldiers to expand his throne's army. Countless people die at his hands every year. And he asked the guy, "Is this the man he wanted to go to the army now?" The red-haired man shifted his gaze then to the little boy who sat near the wall, and realized that this child was a fugitive, though not as well-spoken, but it was their fate after all. At that moment, the bully started laughing loudly all of a sudden. He turned to the guy who had broken the wall with his back and said that their training had just begun, so he dared not run away from him without permission. And besides, no one wanted to come to his aid even now. The boy with blonde hair looked angrily at his master. He was simply furious at this behavior. However, the man continued. He waved the chain on which the other child was tied and said that if he had thought with his head, his companions would not have been hurt. When the man said those words, he immediately threw the chain aside, so that boy fell down dead. He was barely alive because of all the injuries the man had done to him. Nilsi, who was sitting there watching all this, got very angry. But in fact, she had seen these idiots more than once before. At that moment, the girl waved her hand, and a small yellow ball began to appear between her fingers, glowing brightly. But at that moment, she continued to cry. The man, in turn, moved closer to the baby and said that now, if he even begged for mercy, there was no way he would stop. The boy did not take his eyes off the man. But with his hand he began to pick up small stones that were lying nearby. The man had already reached out to beat the child, saying that he would start by ripping his legs off so he certainly couldn't escape. He didn't have time to finish, however, because the boy, as soon as his face came close to him, immediately struck his hand and threw that handful of stones right into his eyes. The man was very surprised and did not even have time to react in any way, as at the same time the poor boy grabbed a splinter from a tree that was lying nearby. He ran straight at the man and was about to stab him in the eye with the splinter from the tree. However, the man managed to react in time and grabbed the guy's arm to stop him from doing so. He tossed it aside immediately because he was very afraid for his life. For if the boy had really done it, he would have died immediately. The child could no longer stand up because of the hard blow. His back hit the rocks and he began to cough up blood, breathing heavily. The man in turn stood up and started walking towards him, angrily saying that he was an idiot, and also saying that he was going to strangle him right now with his own hands. However, just as he was about to get closer, he was blocked by a girl who stood in defense of this poor man. When the villain saw this, he was very surprised. He turned to her angrily, telling her to go away. After all, he didn't have that much time for her. Nilsi examined him from head to toe and concluded that there was no magical power flowing in his body, and his physical stats were quite high. And certainly, ordinary people have no chance of winning against such a river. However, if he is blinded, there will be a chance for a head start. The girl looked back at the boy, who at this time continued to cough up blood, and assumed that he must have analyzed the situation before acting. She also thought that if it wasn't for his young age and weak body, he would even be able to counterattack and possibly win this battle. The man came closer and closer to her and was very angry. He asked her to get out of the way and stay out of his way. Nilsi at this moment began to ponder the fact that surely there must be a person with such martial talent in this novel. But then the bully was very near, and turning to go, he asked, "Did she not hear what he said to her?" However, at this moment, the girl calmly executed a hand movement and struck his hand, which immediately broke away and flew several meters aside. The man, because of the strong shock, did not even immediately realize what had happened. The pain came to him gradually. For a while he just stared at his severed arm, and then he started screaming very loudly because of the pain. The man was in shock, not realizing what had even happened. After all, the moment he touched the girl, his hand was ripped off, and he did not even see what kind of weapon she used. He had no way of knowing how this was even possible, so he turned to her in a trembling voice and asked her who she was. But without waiting for an answer, he looked at her for a while. Then he asked, "Is she really that witch?" Nilsi looked at him at that moment and smiled, and said that even if he guessed, there would certainly be no reward for him. She touched her chest and everything around her started to turn red. She said that if he wondered who she was, he could go and ask Satan himself. And at that very time, the witch directed all her powers and abilities at the man, which pierced his body from all sides. The boy, who was still having a hard time breathing, sat down and watched the whole thing. He was very surprised that someone had actually stood up for him and had taken such a strong revenge on him. The people who were watching all this were very surprised. In fact, there was almost nothing left of this faithfully. Everything was in ruins. One of the visitors looked at all this with horror and said in a striking voice that she had killed the Tartaru officer with a single blow. The other pointed toward the girl herself and told them to look at how much redder her hair had gotten after that spell. Of course, after all that happened, people were terrified and screaming. Even some people ran away in different directions because of their stupid fear. And of course, if all this had happened before, the girl would simply burst into tears. But now it did not happen. It was very surprising to Nilsi. But the moment she killed this man, then all her sadness that had haunted her for so long suddenly vanished, as if it had never existed. Instead, she seemed to be swallowed up by an absolute void. She was rid of any possible emotion. For some time the girl was immersed in her thoughts and tried to make out what was happening to her, as suddenly she was distracted by someone's voice. It was the tavern owner who picked up the baby, who was tied to a chain. He went to the lady and asked her to save the child, for there was something wrong with him. The witch looked at him in surprise and asked why it was that he had suddenly decided to save the stranger boy's minors. The owner, who could barely stay on his feet because of his strong emotions, said he just reminded him of his own son. The man, almost with tears in his eyes, said he had already lost his child once and didn't want to watch another innocent child die who had never even seen life. So he asked very earnestly for the girl to help save him. But for some time Nilsi stood silent and examined him with the boy. She then sat down to examine the baby properly and said that there was a difference in the kinds of power source, and the magic she used is too dangerous. It's like a deadly poison to ordinary people. And even if she tried to heal him now, it would only end up harming him irreparably. The girl touched the boy's face and slowly ran her finger down his cheek, tucking it under. She said in a sad voice that this was the very curse of the witch. Nilsi sighed heavily and said that she was sorry, but unfortunately there was nothing she could do about it. And there was nothing she could do to save this boy. The master, unable to bear it, seized by too much pain, suddenly leaned toward this strange baby and cried out, crying very hard. And at that moment the girl had that strange feeling again, and the tears flowed from her eyes again. She described it as a helpless despair that took over her body and soul with its hands, consuming her deeper and deeper. The girl sat and just watched the owner mourn for this poor boy. And behind the little boy, who had been sitting there all this time without moving, suddenly began to get up. He stepped closer to the witch and bowed to her and went straight to the little guy. He stared at him for a while, and then something happened that no one expected. The boy with hair the color of the sun pointed his hand, and a bright yellow light began to pour from it, which gave warmth. These little lights enveloped first the poor wounded boy, and soon the whole room, which had been destroyed. The witch and the tavern owner could feel this warmth coming from the boy's hand. But at that moment, things got better on the other child's face, where there were wounds and injuries that began to heal, and soon they were completely gone. Then the child, who had been lying unconscious all this time, suddenly opened his eyes and began to breathe evenly. When the owner was shocked to see this, he embraced the child and said it was a miracle. The boy who had healed his fellow man was overjoyed because he had done it. Nilsi, who was watching all this, was even more surprised. She kept her eyes on the boy and thought that he was a holy knight. She could not believe that such a small child could have such incredible talent. But the only holy knight that Tartarus had spawned, she knew and could not understand or accept that he could be this boy. The girl immediately grabbed his hand and removed the small section of cloth he was wearing. Then she saw a small symbol in the middle of his chest, which confirmed her hunch. Nilsi looked closely at the sign that was visible on the boy's chest, and thought immediately that it was Xavier Augustus. In fact, he is the most powerful warrior that Tartarus has created for the Holy Throne in the last 100 years. And he is also the overseer of the Eternal Life Project. In his previous life, this guy was the one who crushed the resistance organized by Ninsi, and he finally killed that bloodthirsty witch who only sought power. If the girl had not used a spell before she died and turned time back in time, this story would have ended with the victory of the Holy See. And so Nilsi realizes that the best way to prevent this tragedy from happening again is to nip the threat in the bud. And in that second, she grabs the boy by the throat. The boy looked at the witch in surprise, not understanding what she was doing, and tried to move away from her hands. They were squeezing his throat harder and harder. But at that moment, a picture of that night killing her appeared in front of the girl's eyes. But even after that, he closed her eyes, even though she was bad. The boy watched the witch's dead body sadly. He was not at all happy that he had done so. Nilsi, seeing this picture, immediately let go of the boy and, on the contrary, stroked his head. She sighed heavily and thought about the fact that she couldn't do that. Perhaps she was just too devastated at that moment, or something shook in her heart. But she couldn't strangle the poor boy so cruelly. So she smiled and asked in a cheerful voice if he wanted to go along with her. But in fact, the girl at that moment could not even guess what it would all turn into. And so many years later, when the boy was all grown up, he ran into Nilsi and hugged her joyfully. He said that he had done all that she had ordered him to do, and in so doing had destroyed the band of robbers. He also asked if that had made her happier. He continued to hug the girl and asked if it was true that she had promised him a reward, and wondered if she would do it. Nilsi, when she took this boy in years ago, didn't know that he would become her biggest problem in life in the future. When it was all over, the girl changed into a man, so that no one would recognize her, and deep in the night, so that there would be fewer stairs, came to the hotel, which was located not far from the tavern. The girl who stood at the front desk in charge of the rooms greeted her cheerfully. Nilsi had an incredibly beautiful appearance. She was able to disguise herself as a man very professionally and still look even elegant. When the girls saw her so beautiful, she was even embarrassed and asked in a trembling voice if he wanted to spend the night at their place. The girl, as the man bowed and said yes, she needed a double room and asked if they could make a plate of food for a small child. And at that moment there was a little boy at the girl's feet who was afraid of everything and hugged her leg in order to feel at least a little safe. When the girl saw him, she said he was incredibly cute and also wondered if it was his little brother. But Nilsi, smiling, said no, for he was being treated as a pet. Soon after all, she was given a separate double room and a whole bowl of food was prepared for the baby. As soon as the girl went up to her room, she looked out the window and saw many guards in the streets, who were putting up notices all over the city that they were looking for her. She, turning to the boy, said that apparently they could not stay long in this city. But when he didn't answer her, the girl looked to the side and saw Harrier greedily eating his spaghetti straight with his hands unashamedly. The girl stepped closer to him and asked, "Didn't anyone teach him how to use cutlery?" Of course, the boy didn't say anything back. He continued shoveling spaghetti into himself. Then Nilsi, with a wave of her hand, with the help of magic, removed all her disguises and took on her former appearance again. She sat down next to the boy and gave him a small fork and asked him to eat with it. It would be more convenient and cleaner. Javier looked at the table appliance in surprise for a while, but when the girl showed him how to use it, he immediately repeated it and was incredibly happy. After all, it was really more convenient. The girl sat down next to him on the chair and with a smile on her face began to watch him eat. When he had emptied his plate, Nilsi inquired, "Is it true that he can't talk?" Well, then she immediately regretted her question, for in the novel, in order to control these children, Tartarus had planted devil insects on them. This kind of parasite has absorbed the 5 senses of the body and eventually made them selfless, by which they have even their own self. By this brutal method, he raised these little children into tireless warriors who thought of nothing but fighting. He considered such people the best weapon in battle, for they have no feelings and do not think about what they are doing accordingly, and will not hesitate. The girl thought at that moment that she needed to get rid of him as soon as possible before it was too late. Well, then she thought also that if she trained him well, perhaps he would learn to speak again. Nilsi was about to use her magic, but quickly pulled her hands away, screaming and saying that she couldn't do that. The girl was very annoyed by this situation, because she knew that it was impossible to kill the devil bug without letting her magic penetrate into this child's body, because by doing so, she might even accidentally kill him. After pondering for a while, the witch realized that she had no other choice, and so she began to use her magical abilities. saying that there was no other way she could do it. She actually really didn't want to do what she had to do, because it had been a long time since she had done such a thing. And at that moment the girl conjured up a huge staff that flew in the air above them, and turning to it, asked some mammon to wake up and not pretend to be dead anymore. And at that moment a very strange face appeared in that staff. It spoke in a low, hoarse voice, addressing the lady and asking if she was all right. When the boy saw it, he was incredibly shocked. He didn't expect a girl to be capable of such a thing. He was immediately wary, and stood up on his hands and began to hiss at this staff. For it was something new and unknown to him, so the boy thought it was dangerous. Staff said his reaction now was the same as hers had been the first day they met. However, the girl sighed heavily and told him to screw the stupidity of it all. In fact, Mammon is such a magic companion wand in Nielsi's possession. He uses her powerful magical power to possess an independent consciousness. And together they overcame a lot of hardships in the past life, so it can be considered that he was the only reliable companion of the girl. However, it's quite different when one sees it with his own eyes. This thing emitted a dark aura that Nielsi could feel. She can't explain why, but she instinctively rejected it with her whole body, and afterward she sealed it into the rift of time and space, for it was too hard for her. If it hadn't been for that boy, she thinks she would never have even seen the creature again. She assumes she wouldn't even need him. But, as luck would have it, he is the only character who has followed Nielsi in order to travel through time. He knows everything in the story that the girl herself doesn't know. After a brief silence, the staff turned to the lady and asked if there was anything he could do for her since she had summoned it. The girl hesitated for a while longer, for she wasn't entirely sure if she could trust him at all. After that, however, she still agreed, and then Mammon gave them a cooking class. Staff said to start by having them wash and clean the magic lizard, cut it into thumb-sized strips, and set it aside. When the oil was hot on the stove, they had to cut the samila fruit and fry it until it was fragrant. He told the girl to fry on high heat until the skin was golden earlier. This was an important point. They would then send the remaining lizard meat to the pot, add the required amount of salt, sugar, and black pepper, and cook, stirring, until the mixture would change color. And at the very end they were to add the moonshadow herb, 7 horns of fresh twigs, and simmer on low heat for 7 hours. The boy and her girl repeated all his actions, and when at last everything was ready, Mammon said that the pot of delicious antidote for magic insects was ready. But at this point, when the girl heard all this information, it made her very angry, and she started yelling at the staff, saying that they needed an antidote, not some dish for dinner. Mammon said in a trembling voice from fright that it was indeed a real antidote, but there was one very important condition that he did not have time to say, because the boy at that moment went to the pot and began to drink the dish quickly. As soon as Javier took the first sip of this soup, he immediately collapsed to the ground because of the intense pain. Maman said that unfortunately, the pain would be unavoidable. The boy was in so much discomfort and pain that he even had blood on his face from the whole thing. The voice from the staff said that the pain while getting rid of demonic insects was unbearable for most people. He also turned to the girl and said that he thought she knew about it, but apparently he was wrong. When she had apparently learned all the information she needed to know, with only one hand at home, she shattered that staff into small pieces so that it would no longer annoy her. And at that moment she even remembered a situation from her childhood, when the holy men had enveloped her with various branches with thorns, which squeezed her to the point of unbearable pain. And now as she looks at poor Javier agonizing over all this pain, she feels bad. Nielsi hugged the boy and said that it was okay. She would share this pain with him, to make him feel better, and it was indeed true. With her magical energy, she took some of his suffering to herself. The girl's face suddenly had various wounds on it because of this, but the boy did feel a little better. They embraced, sat on the floor like that, and the girl said that he might not be afraid, for she was near and would not let him be alone. That night ended horribly, and for a long time Javier was in agony. However, he soon fell asleep, so the girl put him on the bed with her, and they slept like that during the night. However, as soon as the boy woke up, he was very surprised and even embarrassed that he was lying right next to her. He cried out and suddenly felt that he had a voice. Javier began to cough, checking to see if there were indeed any sounds coming from him, and when he heard them, he was incredibly relieved. Nilsi, who was sound asleep at this point because of her fatigue, rolled over onto her other side. The boy was silent at once, so as not to wake her. However, at that moment, he also saw a few tears streaming down her face. He removed them with his hand, and the girl immediately calmed down, even smiling in her sleep. When Javier saw this, he smiled himself. He was really pleased that he could help her calm down. Nilsi herself felt as if she were not in a hotel bed, but in a flower meadow, surrounded by different smells. She felt even more pleasant. The next morning, the girl and the boy went to the bazaar to buy something for themselves. As they passed by the vendors, they heard them beckoning them to stop by and try a new kind of wheat wine. As Javier walked down the street, he kept repeating all these phrases, of course, with mistakes. But it wasn't bad at all. One of the buyers suddenly approached the merchant and said that it was too expensive, because last week the price was much lower, but the merchant, with an indifferent look, only inquired whether he would buy or not. Javier walked contentedly down the street, repeating about how he loved wheat in every phrase he heard from passers-by. Nilsi, who was wearing a cloak and had thrown a hood over herself, thought about the fact that after expelling the devil insects, it only took him half a day to master a very large number of words. And the speed at which he is learning the language is growing like a tremendous leap. Of course, the pronunciation was very difficult, because the boy could not pronounce half of the letters properly, but the meaning was still understandable. But at that moment, a man passed by them, who was not going to stop, and because of this he even pushed the girl. She could hardly stay on her feet, because it was very unexpected. And when Javier saw this, he called her name anxiously, asking if she was doing well. The girl only waved at him in response, and thought about the fact that only when he called her name did he manage to pronounce the letters very clearly, as if the words were not spoken by him at all. When the boy started repeating her name time after time, the girl said he couldn't keep calling her that, so she asked that he call her sister. But Javier continued to say her name and only his. Then the girl decided to make concessions and said that he could also call her sister Nilsi, since he wanted to speak by name after all. However, the boy continued not to listen to her and kept saying her name. The girl at that moment went to one of the stalls and started to buy leaves, thinking that if she wanted to stay in this city, she would have to find a way to disguise it. As she was about to buy new sprouts to make something delicious for dinner, she heard someone's shouts behind her. Nilsi immediately turned in that direction, and then saw that the rider could not handle the horse, and was yelling for everyone to get out of the way, for she had gone wild, and he could not control her. And at that moment, the girl saw the horse galloping straight at Javier. She immediately ran to save him, cursing the distance between them as every second counted. The girl had no time to run, but all was well, for an unfamiliar lady who was passing by grabbed Javier and pulled him away from the horse, which, by then, had calmed down. The rider who had fallen off his animal immediately looked toward the boy and the strange woman, asking if they were okay. He was really worried that he might have hurt them. Nilsi, remaining in the crowd, looked closely at the woman, not realizing who she even was. The girl didn't know who in their right mind would risk their life to save some unknown boy, but the woman looked very worried. She stroked his head and asked if he was hurt. She began to examine his hands and asked if he was in pain and asked that if it hurt, he speak up. Javier looked at her in surprise, not realizing who she even was. However, the woman tearfully asked the toddler what he was asking in the first place. And then, smiling, she added, saying that she was his mother. When the boy and the witch heard this, they were amazed. Shortly afterward, when all was clear, the woman took to the cabin where she lived along with her husband to clear things up properly. When dinner was ready, a man came up to her and said his name was Ford, and this was his wife, Sinara, and he was sorry. He said their son passed away a few months ago, and since then, Sinara has taken all the children on their street as her child, for she has still not recovered from that grief. The woman looked at Javier, who was happily eating the food that was on the table, and said that the point was that the kid looked incredibly like Swift when he was just a kid. At this point her voice began to tremble, and she said, crying, that for a moment she thought it was him. Then she embraced her husband, and the two of them gave vent to their emotions. Nilsi, when she heard all this, stepped aside, asking them not to talk about sad topics in front of her, for she was ready to cry with them as well. The girl shoved the boy away from her so that those man and woman would finally calm down, and so that she wouldn't tear up even more. After a while, she finally calmed down and her tears stopped. The woman also calmed down as she caressed the boy. Nilsi never actually cried while he was alone with Javier. We'd almost forgotten about the body and the damn problem. She realized that it was not advisable for her to stay in this place for long, so she had to find an excuse to leave as soon as possible. The girl had already turned toward them, saying that they were already very late, but at that moment, the man turned to little Javier and asked if he liked swords. The boy lit up with joy, and the man said there were many more in his workshop, so he offered to go and have a look. Nilsi immediately followed them, asking them to wait at least a moment, for the man and the boy were walking very fast. However, when she had already approached, the woman grabbed her hand and said that, although it was very presumptuous, she still really wanted to ask her. The girl felt awkward and even blushed. She asked the witch where their parents were and why they were walking alone. Nilsi was very surprised to hear this, for in fact the parents were never mentioned in the novel. But that didn't matter now. She decided to think of something more convincing. Then the girl with a very sad voice said that they came from the same orphanage and could never see their parents. When the woman heard this, she was very happy, and said that this was a very good thing. Nilsi looked at her in surprise, and asked what that meant. Sinara immediately waved her hands and said that she didn't mean it. She was certainly very sorry for the loss of her loved ones. But then, after a little thought, she said that if that was really the case, she asked if they wanted to be their children. Nilsi was very surprised to hear this, and looked at the woman and asked if not only Javier, but she was offering her too. Sinara smiled and said that she had dreamed all her life of having a daughter as beautiful as her, and she really wanted to comb her hair right now. She looked at the girl warily and asked if they wanted to try it. While the girl went to prepare everything to brush Nilsi's hair, she herself didn't understand why she couldn't say a single word again, even though she should have refused the offer. But she decided not to dwell on it too much. Just think of it as a free hairdresser's service. Soon the girl sat down on a chair and Sinara walked over to her and began to gently brush her beautiful and long hair. Sinara brushed each hair very carefully and said that if she had given birth to a daughter, she would now be as old as Nilsi. She continued talking as if to herself, and asked what was the point of having a boy, since he grew up in no time at all. And in pursuit of his career and his ideals, he left his family behind to pursue only his dreams. However, it ended up being just one grief that everyone is afraid to even think about, in which there is too much pain for the parents. Nilsi wondered if it was an accident, but then realized that was over the top and apologized, saying she shouldn't have asked that. But the woman smiled and said I was really all right, because it was no secret at all. She proceeded to brush the girl's hair and said that he served the Holy See to confront the witch, and ended up sacrificing himself for the good of the community. Shortly afterward, Sinara and her husband went outside, and after saying goodbye to the children, said that since they had agreed to stay for dinner, they should go shopping for groceries. The girl smiled at them goodbye and told them that they would be back very soon, so they could not miss them. Nilsi waved goodbye and said they would see each other later. She sat next to the sleeping Javier and suddenly felt sad when the door closed. At that moment, a small red light appeared beside her, and from it came a voice saying that she was consumed with guilt for having killed their son. Of course it was Maman. And the girl looked at him angrily, saying that since he didn't understand human language, maybe she should hit him one more time to finally get through to him. The creature was silent for a while. She turned back into a staff and said that she only wanted to warn her. She should be careful with this couple. His voice grew quiet and menacing, and he said that perhaps this invitation had been a conspiracy all along. And instead of sitting back and waiting to die, however, he didn't have time to finish you, for the boy was already awake, and Nilsi asked him to be quiet. At this very time, Sinara, together with Ford, came to the bazaar. She asked to be given a fish and a kilogram of good ribs. However, when she approached another counter, she began to be indignant, not understanding how on earth they could sell such meat, since it was not fresh at all. Soon their purchases finally ran out and they had no more hands left to carry it all. Ford turned to his wife and asked if she was sure the children would be able to eat it all. After all, they had bought so much stuff. But the girl, almost with tears in her eyes, said that it had been a very long time since their house had been so lively. So she felt that these purchases had not been made in vain. But at that moment their conversation was interrupted by the voice of men standing nearby. One of them said that it was terrible, and the worst part was that it had happened very close to them. Sinara was immediately alert. She approached the two men and asked them what had happened and why they were so worried. A man who knew her turned to her and told her that she had come just in time, for a very terrible thing had happened. He was silent for a while, not knowing how to tell the girl that. And then he added in a quiet voice that the witch had unfortunately returned. Another man explained that only a few days ago an officer had been killed in a neighboring town, and a child kidnapped, after which she had fled, perhaps coming even to their township. But his partner tried to calm him down, telling him not to say that to Mrs. Sinara, for he knew very well what had happened in their family, and it was too hard. The girl was silent for a while, and then said that it was actually okay. They could keep talking. They could describe to her the appearance of the child she had kidnapped. Some more time had passed since that moment, and Nilsi, who at this time was sitting and playing with the boy, saw the door open. Turning there, she wondered if they had come back, but seeing only one girl, she asked where Mr. Ford was. Sinara was like being lowered into water. She closed the door behind her. She realized that under no circumstances could she arouse suspicion. So, putting a happy smile on her face, she said that he had gone to the workshop to get something, and she would prepare their food now. The girl also said that they must be starving by now. She walked over to a small table and unloaded the food there, and said she didn't know what they liked, so she took a little bit of everything. Nilsi, seeing all this variety of food, was very excited, and the woman, in turn, said that she really hoped they would like it. Javier, who was standing nearby, suddenly saw the landlady pull a pair of scissors from behind her back and became very wary. The boy realized that she was up to something bad, so he immediately snatched the scissors from her hands and was about to throw them at the woman. However, just as he was about to direct them to her case, he couldn't move. The boy didn't understand what was happening, but he felt the presence of magic. Then Javier looked at Nilsi, who pointed her hand in their direction and started screaming, asking for her to let him go already. For a while the girl continued to hold him with her magic, in order to prevent the boy from doing anything stupid. Sinara, who had been watching all this with horror, called her a scarlet witch, and she was even disgusted by the name herself. The girl came up and snatched the scissors from the boy, saying that she did not remember giving him permission to act like that. But Javier immediately protested and said that they wanted to kill her. Nilsi, with the scissors in her hands, hesitated and asked if it was true. Then she looked at the boy and asked with a smile on her face if he thought she needed his protection. She twirled those scissors on her finger and told him not to mix it up, and then she walked over to the woman, grabbing her so that she couldn't even move. She pointed the scissors straight at her throat and said that she was a witch who did all sorts of evil, so she certainly didn't need any help. She said she had planned to wait until they were done billeting, and before she did anything, she was insanely sorry it had happened this way. At that moment something happened that the girl certainly didn't expect. A bullet flew into her hand that she was holding the girl with. The witch felt no pain, but then she heard Fort yell to his wife to run away. Sinara took advantage of this moment and was able to escape from the witch's hands, starting to immediately run for her life. Javier stepped closer to Nilsi and looked at her in surprise. He thought that she must be in a lot of pain, because the bullet had gone straight through her arm. That, in fact, had gone very well. The girl showed in her hand the bullet that the man had shot, and smiled as she did so. When Fort saw this, he was very surprised. His hands began to tremble, for he was really convinced that she was a witch. Then Sinara turned to the boy, who was coming closer and closer to her, and told him to go to them quickly, for it was very dangerous. He said that this witch had tricked him, and asked if he even knew how many people she had killed, and if he stayed with her, he would suffer very badly. She spared no one. Javier looked surprised at the woman, who smiled at him and asked him not to be afraid. She called him her son and said she would be sure to protect him. The boy was about to say something, but at that moment Nilsi shoved him aside toward the people. He looked at her in surprise, not sure what she was doing. The girl started walking towards the exit, and Sinara hugged the boy who was lashing out. The girl said she was telling the truth, and it would be better if he stayed with these people. Nilsi also said that she won't have to be a nanny anymore, and they will adopt him like they wanted. So everyone would be happy in this situation. However, at that moment, the boy broke free from the girl's arms and started running straight after the witch. He ran to her and immediately hugged her hard around the waist, asking tearfully why she was doing all this. Nilsi, in turn, without turning around, said that he could grow up in a complete and normal family, have a father and mother who loved him, his future bright. The girl also said that he could pursue a career he liked and be with the people he liked. Javier can have the dream life instead of being chased everywhere and subjected to hatred and exile among all people. She also said that she herself knows very well that it would be the right option for him than staying together with her. But Javier hugged her harder and said that he didn't want any of those things. The boy said he didn't care about exile or hatred. He wanted them to always be together. At this point, the woman was crying very loudly and tried to break free from her husband's arms to take the boy with her so that he would not be in danger. Ford, from whom she had taken the weapon, told her to calm down, for they could not fight the witch. But the woman didn't care. She was completely consumed by the emotions of anger and hatred. Sinara pointed her weapon toward the witch, saying that she would never again allow her to hurt innocent people like she had done to her son. Nilsi, who wanted to leave, asked if she really thought they were innocent. Then she asked if she had ever wondered what her son had been doing at the Holy See. Seeing the misunderstanding on the witch's face, Nilsi asked if she really didn't know anything about it, or if it was easier for her to deny the truth. In fact, one day Sinara did go to her son's house to give him fresh shirts, and peering through the window, she saw atrocious things. Her son stood over the bound man and beat him half to death with a whip. The man was in so much pain that he even stopped screaming. Sinara couldn't stand these emotions and began to shake, dropping the gun to the floor. The woman said with a shaky voice that it wasn't true, and it just couldn't be, because her boy was completely different, and she must have mistaken him for someone else. But then she said with a frantic smile on her face that it didn't matter because she had killed so many people that she couldn't even remember him. But the witch came closer to her and told her that she remembered perfectly well. She remembered every person who had died at her hands. There were indeed quite a few of these people, but Nilsi vividly remembers the last moments of this boy's life, lying all bloody and calling out for his mom in the last seconds of his existence. In fact, after the witch burned his body and took all his sins upon herself, he left this world with complete peace of mind. A whole 6 years had passed since that day. Javier had time to grow up a lot and even came to work to get by. And one day in a small village, children were walking outside and fighting over a doll that a boy had made. The smaller girl pulled it toward her, and the older girl pulled it toward him, and they both said he had made it especially for her. The guy himself stood and laughed, telling them to stop arguing already, because it was just a regular rag doll. He also said he could make another one for the girl. But the little girl protested and said she didn't want him to make a doll like hers, but the other said she just wanted one just like it. The boy turned to the side and said that if things continued like this, the two sisters would rise up against each other and become enemies. He turned to Javier, who was just coming toward them, and told him to think of a way to make things right, because it was his fault. Shortly afterward, the boy went on another work order. He was using his magic to screw nails into some huge device. A girl with pink hair came up behind him and thanked him for his hard work, and asked him if he wanted to take a break, as it was quite hot outside that day. But the guy, interrupted from his work, said it was okay. After all, he's almost done, so he'll rest after he's done. He took a small pebble out of his bag and inserted it into the middle, saying that all he had to do was insert the core. And as soon as he did, the device immediately began to work. Things appeared inside it, and they became clean as soon as the magic water hit it. The man immediately went up close to the appliance and told me that, as I looked at it, and the work produced amazing results, and he was even shocked at how the thing could work at all, for it had broken too much that time. The pink-haired girl's mom walked up to the boy and bowed, saying that he had helped them a lot, so they were incredibly grateful to him. Javier smiled and started putting his tools away. He said that everything was in order now, but next time, if anything went wrong, they should call him right away, so they wouldn't waste time and money. Then the man approached his wife and asked if his sister was getting better. The boy laughed awkwardly and said that everything was still the same, as long as he only had to fiddle with things. But the man pointed a finger up and said that his sister was a real genius. If the magic device she made was sold in the city, she would surely be the most popular. But his wife immediately pushed him to the side, implying that those were not the most appropriate words. While Javier picked up his bag at this point and said that he was actually pleased to hear their praise. But if it went into mass production, his sister's body wouldn't be able to take the strain, and he felt that what they had now was enough. A girl came up to him with hope in her eyes and asked if he would like to have lunch with them. But the boy waved goodbye and said that he was grateful, but that he would refuse. And not to be too rude, he smiled and said goodbye, that he just had to go back and make dinner for his sister, so he couldn't linger. The whole family accompanied him with a look. The girls were impressed with Javier and said with one voice that he was an incredibly good boy. And the man who was holding the bag of money immediately ran after him to pay for the repairs. At this time, Javier had already returned to the city to go home to his sister, passing by a guy who was unloading a wagon, but he immediately turned his attention to him. He was about to call out to the boy, but suddenly someone grabbed him from behind and pulled him back. The boy was very surprised at this, but his mouth was closed. He had no time to do anything. Javier looked away in surprise, stood for a while, but then went on without seeing anything there. The guy who was suddenly grabbed asked the girl with the pink hair who did it if she was okay, and why she did it in the first place. The girl said that her father had asked her to give him money for repairs, and she wanted to follow him home and see where he lived. The boy asked in surprise if she was a stalker. However, the girl smiled and told him to think for himself, because these brother and sister have been living in their village for almost 6 years, but no one knows the people of the town, what his sister looks like, because no one has ever seen her. So she asked the boy if he was not curious to know. At this time, Javier went on his way. He went into the market to buy a pumpkin for his sister, and this guy and girl started following him. The boy had agreed to this adventure just so she wouldn't do anything stupid. When Javier walked past people, everyone said hello and smiled in greeting. The guy who was watching all this from the bushes was very surprised. He did not understand why Javier was so popular wherever he was. But the girl looked at him and said that he was just jealous. Their stakeout lasted all the way to Javier's house, who didn't even realize anyone was watching him. The boy and girl, running straight after the boy, saw a hut nearby, and then she said they were almost there, and it must be their home. When they came closer, they saw that the door was unlocked, and they were very surprised at this. The boy walked first, and the girl behind him. He called out to Javier as soon as he entered the house, but the girl was afraid, so she whispered that he must not be home after all. At that moment, however, the children heard someone talking. It was the indignant voice of the quarryman who was addressing Nilsi. He asked if she had fallen asleep in the laboratory again. The girl in turn replied that she just wanted to sleep too much, and the boy said that she was working too hard so she would get sick so soon. He left the room and said that the food would be ready very soon, so she only had to wait a little while. The girl wanted to object, but she didn't have time. When Javier came downstairs, he saw his friends. He walked up to them in surprise and asked why they were here all of a sudden. A girl with bright pink hair hid behind her friend's back and said that they had come to give him the money for the repairs. Javier replied that they didn't have to do that. Then the girl looked out from behind her friend's back and asked if he had just talked to his sister and wondered if they could meet her by chance. Javier was silent for a while. He pondered what to say to them, but then, smiling, he apologized, saying it wouldn't be convenient to do so. But the boy had no time to finish the last sentence, for behind them they heard the voice of Nilsi, who came down from above and asked what was going on and why it was so noisy. As soon as the children looked at this girl, they were in a pleasant shock. Nilsi was incredibly beautiful, so even they couldn't say anything. Nilsi was wearing her nightgown and a cape over it. She fixed her hair and looked at Javier, wondering if they had company. Soon they were all seated at the table, and Javier had tea ready for them. There was an awkward silence between them all. They didn't know what to say at all. Nilsy was so worried that her hands were shaking. She didn't know what to do or what she should say. In fact, since she'd brought Javier to this place, she'd lived in seclusion for a while. Every day at home, she has cooked a delicious meal, fed, clothed, and it is Javier who does all the work of communicating with strangers. And the end result of all of this is that all of her social skills were practically nil. So Nilsy didn't know what young people generally like to talk about nowadays, and she worried that she might be thought old-fashioned and that Javier would be bullied if she suddenly said the wrong thing. Right now, what she wished more than anything was that she could just have someone help her with this communication, because it was too awkward. At this very time, the girl with pink hair didn't take her eyes off Nilsy. She only thought about how beautiful she was, and it was no wonder to her that with such a beautiful sister, Javier is totally indifferent to the offers of the village girls. And compared to this beautiful girl, she considers herself almost a non-entity. After some more time of silence, Nilsy asked why they had come. Did they have some important business to attend to? The guy replied that it wasn't really anything important. They just wanted to give her the money for the repairs, and he just wanted to stop by to visit Javier's relatives. The girl with pink hair said she didn't expect Javier and his sister to be so different. After all, they don't look alike at all. But her friend said in her ear that it was very rude and she shouldn't say that. Nilsy in turn said that there is no blood relation between them. They are both just orphans taking care of each other in this troubled world. When the girl heard this, she immediately thought about it, and the witch was wary at this point, not understanding why she was having such a reaction, and thinking that she had said something wrong. Javier entered the conversation at that moment and turned to his friend and asked if she was all right, for she had turned so pale. The girl immediately replied that she was fine, but that she was just a little hungry. And at that moment she was glad, because Javier was worried about her. At that moment the boy said that was fine, and asked if they would let him buy them some more tea. Nilsy then immediately turned to her, asking her what snacks she liked, and asking if she wanted a cake or cookies for tea. But Javier was very surprised at his sister's reaction, and asked her to wait just a little while. But the girl kept talking and offering different food options. He leaned lower to his sister and asked in her ear if she was sure she wanted to do it herself, since she had never cooked before. The girl laughed nervously and asked what he was even talking about, what kind of nonsense he was talking about, and also wondered if she had never cooked for him. She thought about it, and couldn't remember a single dish she'd ever cooked for Javier, and the girl said that she'd never really done it. Of course, the boy wasn't surprised, because all these years he had been cooking for them himself. Guy rolled up his sleeves and said he'd better do it himself. After all, he's been doing this chore all these years. She had to be careful not to hurt herself. Nilsy said it was different this time. She got up from the table and took him by the shoulders and told him not to worry. It was the first time he'd ever brought friends to his house, so she wouldn't let him down. The girl looked at him pitifully and asked him to trust her and let her do it. Kabir was a little surprised at this behavior of his sister, but then he smiled and said okay. He didn't mind. She got excited at this point and said that in that case, she wanted to show them all her skills in the level of cooking. A whole 3 hours had passed since then, and the cake was finally ready. The girl was very tired and even smeared herself, but she still managed to do something. When Javier's friends saw it, they said that the appearance of the cake is not really important. What matters is how it tastes. They decided to try it, even though it looked disgusting. But when they all cut off a piece, they realized it was even worse. The guy turned to his friend and said it looked like it was burnt on the outside, but not cooked on the inside. It's too sweet, and it feels like it's almost all sugar. Nilsy, when she also tasted it, she realized that using the warp spell to cook strawberries was a bad idea. That's what made it smell earthy. She immediately took the cake and started to carry it away, apologizing and saying she'd rather bring something more ready. However, at that moment, Javier's voice was heard saying that it was very tasty, the cream well whipped. If you bake it for a long time, there will even be a burning flavor. He smiled and told his sister that he really liked the taste of the cake. Everyone was surprised to hear that. He at this point walked over to her and began wiping the crumbs from her face that had soiled her. When Javier's friend saw this, she was no longer worried. The girl smiled. She was very pleased to see him taking care of his sister. Well, quite a few hours had passed since then, and the sun was already starting to set over the horizon. Javier cleared the table and told his sister that it was too late and she should go to bed. When Nielsi looked out the window, she saw that it was getting dark, and she said that she hadn't really noticed how fast the time had gone by. Getting up from the table, she turned to the boys and asked how about staying with them this evening, for it probably wouldn't be very comfortable for them to go in the dark. When the boy and girl heard this, were very surprised. But the girl immediately said that they could take it easy and make themselves at home, and if they didn't mind, they could call her sister as well, just like Javier. The guy even froze when he heard it. He'd been wiping crumbs off the table before, but he was surprised to hear it. Then she apologized to them all and said she had to go. Javier's friends immediately said goodbye to her, and they had a very pleasant experience. When his sister disappeared into the room, the girl turned to her friend and said that at first glance she seemed cold. However, she was surprisingly easy to get along with. He agreed, and then wondered if they could really call her sister now too. The guy and the girl in one voice began to repeat this word from time to time, but then suddenly Javier got very angry and said in a cold voice that they can't do that. You can't do that. The guy was incredibly angry and looked at the two of them and said that it was actually his sister and they had no right to call her that. Soon afterward, he calmed down and made a bed in a separate room for his friends. It was already quite dark outside, and before leaving he wished the boys a good rest. Javier also said that if they ever needed anything, they should just go to him. His room was at the end of the hallway. His friends were still impressed by his shouting. He in turn waved to them and said goodnight, and then left. And once Javier's footsteps died down, the children could breathe out a sigh of relief at being alone. The girl turned to her friend and advised him never to make Javier angry again in the future. Afterward, they lay down on the soft bed and were very happy, especially the girl. She began to twist from side to side, enjoying the soft mattress beneath her, and said it was her first time sleeping out of the house, and it was incredibly exciting for her. She took the top floor, and the guy, when he saw her joy, told her not to fall off the bed, especially at night. As he was about to lay down to go to his room, she peeked out of her soft bed and asked how about wandering out in the middle of the night and exploring these surroundings. The guy, hearing this, was very surprised and asked, "Is she crazy?" "Since she wants to," but the girl replied that if they went now, they might even be able to find the cannibal's lair. The boy was surprised and asked what it was, since he had never heard of it before. She then inquired, "Doesn't he know?" Then she said that the story had been passed down from generation to generation. She explained that a long, long time ago, at that time, a young man like this fellow had lived in the village. His name was Ram, too. Ram is a diligent young man who goes to the mountains very often to catch wild animals in order to feed his family. One day, as usual, he went hunting on the mountain and happened to find a roller, which was entangled in the goza and could not move. Ram thought he was lucky and went to catch this very rabbit, for it was an easy prey for him. However, he didn't expect Vine to attack him. It was as if it were alive, and no matter how much he struggled, it was all in vain. Poor Ram was simply engulfed by the vines and gradually disappeared in the grass. After a few days, the family got tired of waiting for the boy to come home, and they started searching that mountain. However, after several days of searching, they still hadn't found anyone. A little later, the villagers discovered her huge grape bush, on which for some reason very pretty flowers bloomed. The girl lowered her voice and said cheerfully that here they had found him. She started down to her friend's head and said, "Poor emaciated," but Ram was hanging up there and all that was left of him was his skin. Ram, who heard the story, was very much frightened. He even shouted, almost to the whole house. The girl, in turn, laughed and said that he was incredibly frightened. When the girl lay back in her bed and cheerfully told him to relax because she wasn't going to scare him anymore, so she offered to talk about something else. But when she heard no answer, she looked up in surprise, asking, "Is he really asleep?" The boy was faint after such a fright. She lay back in bed and thought about the fact that she was spending the night at her lover's house for the first time, and it was very exciting, but at the same time, she was sad. After all, he had such a good relationship with his sister that she couldn't even believe that they just considered themselves relatives. For a while, the girl just lay there and tried to sleep, but she didn't succeed. So she left the room and decided to go for a walk.